end of our conference, which this year has seen a large participation and intense scientific exchange between different research fields. And we are now thinking about the possibility of collecting some of the contributions presented in the conference for a volume publication, and I invite anyone interested to submit the contribution to the ASTRIL working paper series to do this. We closed the conference with the final lecture by Professor Stockhammer entitled From Secular Stagnation to Stagflation, European Growth Models Under Higher Interest Rate. And Stockhammer is Professor of International Political Economy in the Department of International and European Studies at King's College London. He headed the Political Economy Research Group at Kingston University and the research groups at INET, the Austrian Science Fund, and the International Labour Office. And on topics related to financialization, income distribution, and growth, he has written numerous contributions which have become points of reference, I can say, in the scientific debate. And so, please, Professor Stockhammer.
Thank you. Thanks for those nice words of introduction, and thanks for Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is it better? Right, where was I? I was praising the conference, which of course it is an item we certainly wanna complete. So I thought, in particular, the work of the younger cohort of heterodox Italian economists is very impressive. It is a very interesting and original mix of post-Keynesian theory of an Italian flavor with modern quantitative methods, which I think is quite impressive. Right, so I was asked to give a keynote lecture, and the starting point, given the topic of the presentation at the times we are living in, of course, had to do something with inflation. So I'll talk a little bit about inflation, but with most keynotes, I'll mostly be talking about what I've been doing in the last few years. That doesn't fit perfectly because I've not been working on inflation. I've been working on growth models and comparative political economy. You'll hear a lot more about that. But it turns out there is some connection between growth models and inflation, or in particular what I will regard as the main outcome of the inflationary process. That is, I do think that interest rates will be higher in the long term. Right, so what is it that I'm doing? The starting point is that issue of inflation. Is inflation just a one-off? Is it here to stay longer? My main argument is no, actually inflation will not stay longer with us, but it will have a side effect, or it will contribute to something else, and that is that interest rates, I think, will be substantially higher in the coming years. And then a big part of my lecture is, so what are the implications of those high interest rates? And here come the growth models. I'll be filtering that through a growth models perspective, which of course begs the question, so what then are growth models? And as you'll see, the lecture will implicitly be an overview of what a field that's called comparative political economy. So when Sergio at the introduction said that I'm professor for international political economy, in this case, this actually matters. I'm not, contrary to what you might believe, given my publication record, I'm actually not an economist. Or to be more precise, I'm not an economist anymore. Some 4 years ago, the actually very lively department we had at Kingston disintegrated because of a downsizing of the university. And I not only moved university, but I also switched discipline. So I'm now an international political economist. I didn't know that I was one, but apparently I am one. But ever since I've changed my job, I've also changed my my research focus a bit, and also my publication outlets, and that will bring us to the issue of comparative political economy. Now, in that field, there's a big distinction between export-led and debt-led growth models, and I'll be discussing that, and I'll, in particular, will be showing you some evidence on the salience of different growth drivers. And then towards the end of that lecture, I'll come back to that question. So what do higher interest rates mean in the context of the growth models or different growth drivers since the global financial crisis? So is inflation here to stay? My answer to that is no, but. What's the no? I think it's important to keep in mind when we talk about inflation, of course, the inflation rates that we are used to over the last decade or so are, by historical standards, very low. Now, we have a sharp increase in inflation. That was discussion, the topic of the panel yesterday, that in Europe is mostly externally driven by energy prices and by supply side disruptions. In the US, there is a case to be made that it has more domestic causes. If in Europe it is mostly driven by the energy price shocks, then it means that the inflation will go away as soon as the energy price shocks go away, and the energy price shocks will go away. We don't know how fast, but they're unlikely to last very long. Once those energy price shocks are gone, inflation will take some time to come down. And that's essentially because in this year and the coming year, the European workers may have real wage losses of order of magnitude 5% or so, depending on the country, and that will certainly push up their wage demands in the following years a little bit. But again, and you have quite concentrated businesses that will resist. Those will like to pass on that wage pressure and will be able to do so. So there will be a bit of an aftermath of elevated inflation, but it will not be spectacular. But overall, I would think that within 3 years or so, inflationary pressures will mostly be gone. Now, I said that firms have quite a bit of markup power. That's a plot of the changes of markups. It's actually from mid last year, so it's not fully up to date. Comparing the markup to essentially the pre-COVID period. And what you see there is that essentially you have firms on both ends, and you have roughly half of the firm in the middle. The markups don't change much. In other words, they're passing on the price increases. You have a quite substantial number of firms that increase markup strongly. So if you want, that's an argument for actually, to some extent, it's firms driving the inflation. And mind you, if you look at these firms, these are not just energy producers. There are also other firms in there. But if you look at the distribution overall, they are more or less offset by firms that have severe reductions in markup. And in a way, if you have an energy price increase, you would expect it. Yeah? I mean, it shouldn't be primarily the British firms that are benefiting from it. Thus, the symmetrical picture actually does tell you to some extent that firms have an active role in passing on those price increases. Now, why is that important for the inflationary process? Because that means that if workers in the following years want to catch up a little bit on their wage losses that they will be experiencing in this and the coming year, there's firms that have a lot of markup power in pursuing that or in passing on those increases. That's why I don't think that inflation will immediately go away. Now, while I don't think that inflation is here to stay, I do think that higher interest rates will be here to stay. And again, here's a plot to illustrate just how extraordinarily low interest rates have been over the past decade. And we know why that is. There was the global financial crisis, and then there was an extreme monetary tightening, including quantitative easing. Now, these are 10 years US government bonds, so they're not fully representative, but I think the trend is pretty clear. And I mean, there's some historical research that says that's part of a longer-term trend, but that's not my point. My point is that what the pickup that you see at the very end here, I think that's the direction that we'll be going. That is in part a change in the interest policy of central banks, but a big part of that is that I think the current inflationary experience will induce central banks to speed up their getting out of quantitative easing. I'm not saying they're doing so for good reasons, but I think that is what they will be doing. Central banks, both internally but also from conservative politicians, are essentially blamed, rightly or wrongly, for allowing high inflation, and I think one of their responses will be that they will taper out quantitative easing. Once you have that, combined with changed interest policy, I think we will end up with higher interest rates and with more fragile financial markets. And mind you, the extent of quantitative easing that we've had over the past 10 years is hard to exaggerate. The order of magnitude in most countries is their balance sheets have increased by some 50 percentage points of GDP. That's massive. That's by historical standards just massive, what's been going on there. I don't think they will continue that balance sheet expansion, and if you want, the inflation hawks in the central banks will be getting a stronger voice. Now, it's very pleasant that my slides have come back because that allows me to continue the lecture. So if that's the case, if those interest rates will really go up, what does that mean? That will be the third part of the lecture, but in between I have to tell you how I'm going to approach that, and that's via the growth models and comparative political economy. So I don't know how many of you have actually come across the term growth models and comparative political economy. In heterodox economics, it's still a bit of a niche issue, and that's because comparative political economy is by and large a field outside economics. It's in the social and political sciences. What you see here is two important books. So the first is a book that Marc Lavoie and I have edited, which was sort of the post-Keynesian take on growth models and was our step from the demand regimes and Baduri-Margli into a more applied growth model analysis. In the middle, you have the book that just came out, edited by Baccaro, Blythe, and Pontusson, called Diminishing Returns, which from a heterodox economics point of view is a really awkward title because it flirts with marginal productivity theory, which is not at all what this book is about. So I don't like the title. I should admit I'm an interested party because I have a paper in that book. And that is an attempt to flesh out the research program of comparative political economy and growth models. Then we have a recent special issue in the review of Keynesian economics, which essentially is here as an illustration that there's also an increasing awareness in the more standard heterodox economics journals that there's something interesting going on here in comparative political economy. And I should say, Egypt, another heterodox journal, is also having a special issue coming up. So what is this comparative political economy? Let me give you a bit of background and sort of thereby outline how I understand the context of the debate and how I myself got into the debate. So if you're doing a very broad brush history of economic thought, political economy thought in the 19th century, we have a relatively united field. I don't mean theoretically, I mean in terms of understanding what the field is about, but also to some extent methodologically. In the 19th century, ranging from Karl Marx all the way to Ricardo and Smith, and I would put the German Historical School and the likes in there. And somewhere at the turn of the 20th century, we get a division of economics and the social and political sciences with quite demarcated areas of investigation, what sort of legitimate research questions are, what needs to be explained, and often that also comes with sort of a preconditioning of what sort of methodologies are acceptable. Now, that separation of economics and the social and political sphere, of course, from a heterodox economics perspective is perverse, because in our view, we can't ultimately really separate it, but of course it shapes how the disciplines are evolving. And so we can think of the history of economics then as various streams of mainstream economics and heterodox economics, and most traditions in heterodox economics would one way or another positively refer back to the political economy tradition. One of the things, as a footnote here, that bugs me when I think about the history of post-Keynesian economics is that question: when did post-Keynesian economics start or stop using the term political economy? It's very clear now. I mean, I regularly use the abbreviation PKE, Post-Keynesian Economics. We have the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics and so on. If you go back to the earlier literature, the post-Keynesians very often used the term political economy. Somewhere around 1980-ish, that changes. Yeah? And I suspect there's an interesting story where and when that exactly happens and what exactly that means, but I don't have a good story on it. I just want to throw it out if anyone has interesting ideas. But either way, the short version of what I'm saying here is heterodox economics in a way is the continuation of political economy in the field of economics. No? I mean, on the one hand, we're emphasizing that we're in a political economy approach. On the other hand, a lot of us are not really addressing the political questions. Yeah? We recognize that various aspects of economics have a political dimensions, but we're not really doing, if you want, the class struggle analysis or the power analysis. So in parallel to what's happening in economics, that we have a split in heterodox and mainstream economics, in various social sciences, in particular from the 1960s and 70s onwards, you get a crystallization of fields that are also trying, that are either building on political economy or trying to resurrect political economy subfields. And that's comparative political economy, international political economy, and if I take a little bit of liberty, also economic sociology. We could probably extend that and include some parts of human geography in there, but the details are not that important. The important thing is that in the social and political sciences, we also get political economies. Now, they are shaped by their own disciplines that they're coming out. So much like heterodox economics, they're not embracing all that political economy was once, but they sort of have the ambition of working towards that. And but when they refer back to political economy and to critical approaches in economics, their history of economics usually ends around the debate between Keynes and Hayek. Yeah? They often don't have a very good understanding of heterodox economics or the economics internal controversies in the post-war era. And indeed, effectively, a big part of my new job is to tell those comparative political economists and international political economists that actually post-Keynesian economics is really cool and very interesting and also useful for the questions that they are trying to answer. So the way I think about that is that in a way, that unified project of 19th century political economy has fragmented, has split up, but there is a field of diverse and not always very well communicating subfields of political economy, which includes much or most of heterodox economics and big parts of comparative political economy, CPE, IPE, probably most parts or more than half of economic sociology. That's a different question. And then there's an interesting question whether we would accept that part of mainstream economics would also be in there, but big parts of them is not. I mean, general equilibrium is not. Neo-institutionalism probably actually would make its way in. So the mainstream economics block outside here maybe would need to be qualified. So what is it that I will be specifically talking about? I'll be talking about debates in comparative political economy, and that field long had a very strong presence of what is called the varieties of capitalism approach, which I would argue is actually a political economy correspondence to certain forms of mainstream economics. And then much more recently, we have the growth models approach, which is in the field of comparative political economy, but to a large extent tries to incorporate insights from post-Keynesian economics. So what is comparative political economy about? It's a field that is essentially, as the name suggests, comparative. It compares mostly countries. In practice, it often has a bit of an obsession with country classifications, but so it has a strong institutionalist flavor and is asking, well, there are substantial institutional differences between different forms of capitalism. Does that also affect how economies are working? Does that give them particular strengths and weaknesses, and so on? Because it's a political economy project, it in a way needs a theory of economic growth as well as a theory of institutions. And mind you, most of heterodox economics actually, the institutionalists notwithstanding, but most of heterodox economics actually is not very developed in terms of its theories of institutions. And here are some references on the field, if you want to take a look at it. So, if there is a mainstream in CP, or if there was one, it's varieties of capitalism. Now, when I say mainstream, I mean that in terms of dominant or most prominent approach, it's not the same sort of mainstream, the same sort of suppressive form of dominance that mainstream economics has. It's just the strongest approach and the most important reference point. Now, that would be David Soskich, Peter Hall, who had the famous book in the early 2000s on the varieties of capitalism. Theoretically, it's actually interesting mixture of neo-institutionalist theories of the firm. It's sort of a transaction costs approach to economics mixed with a bit of new Keynesian medium-term analysis. But the important part of their argument is that because of uncertainty, because of transaction costs, there's actually multiple equilibria in terms of institutions in capitalism. And for VOC, that's essentially the liberal market economies, the Anglo-Saxon countries, and the coordinated market economies, so that would be Germany and Japan. And one of them is sort of more arm's length and has more labor market flexibility and more market-mediated forms of financial interactions and also different education systems. And then in the coordinated one, you have stronger institutions, you have unions, you have bargaining, but you also have more job security, and therefore you have a different set of labor relations. So important for them, for the VOC, those different types of capitalism, institutionally founded, give you different types of comparative advantage. So it's that funny mixture of neo-institutionalism, a bit of flirtation with mainstream categories, comparative advantage, but also some sort of flirtation with more leftist concepts, because ultimately, politically, what they were doing, saying, neoliberalism is not the only game in town. There is an alternative. The alternative to liberal capitalism is coordinated capitalism, and it works. It gives you different comparative advantages. So it has interesting aspects, but in terms of its economic foundation, it's not particularly heterodox. Now, in practice, if you look at a lot of the applied research, the neo-institutionalism actually takes a back step, and there's a lot of country classification. And so, no, there's not just coordinated liberal market economies, there's also mixed market economies, and then for developing countries, you have even more forms of market economies. And there's less and less theory and more classification. But it's comparative political economy, so they're really excited about their country groups. I'm emphasizing that because I'm also an international political economist, and the international political economists really don't like country classifications. They like global mechanisms and world systems and what have you. So it's also a political economy, but it doesn't have that sort of bias towards country classification, but it has much more bias towards global mechanisms. And again, there's more references, but I think for what I'm doing, they're not that important. So what then is the growth models approach? So since the global financial crisis, now there always has been criticisms of the VOC, in particular that it's firm-centric and it's nation-centric, and it downplays the importance of class struggles. The political science people, in particular the critical ones, can make long lists of shortcomings. But with the global financial crisis, there was another big push that there's something important missing and that we need an alternative to the VOC approach. And Baccaro and Pontusson have written a very important and now widely cited paper in those debates where they propose the growth models approach, which very heavily builds on post-Keynesian concepts, in particular on various papers in the book that Marc Lavoie and I published. And in that book, we essentially have done that step from quite theoretically oriented work around wage-led versus profit-led demand regimes. So that's the debate on the Badawi-Maglin model. But sort of in the more applied analysis of those demand regimes, we moved to the concept, we actually use the term growth models there, emphasizing that there's other factors next to income distribution that are very important in shaping those economies, in particular asset prices, household debt on the one hand, and export performance and the drivers of export growth or the absence thereof. And so in a way, we had to move from wage-led versus profit-led demand regimes to debt-driven versus export-driven growth models, and also various empirical applications to that. And that, I should say, was work for the ILO, and we were eager in that book collection to not be too technical, such that policymakers or advisors with an academic background could understand what we are doing. And so the book, in a way, was also to some extent accessible to political scientists. And so Baccaro and Pontusson, in particular, pick up on the Kaleckian element of that and analyze the post-war era as essentially a form of wage-led growth, and then, and that's not what Marc Lavoie and Eckhart Hein and others have done, but that's Baccaro and Pontusson thought of it. They thought that all the post-1990 neoliberal growth models are actually profit-led. That's not what I and other post-Keynesian think, but that's at least to some extent productive misunderstanding, because Baccaro and Pontusson then do interesting things with that. But either way, they're very heavily built on the debt-driven versus export-driven distinction. Baccaro and Pontusson call it export-led and consumption-led. Again, a bit of a shift in interpretation and shift in terminology, but essentially they're building on the distinction that post-Keynesians had approached. So what's happening there? Essentially, it's a country classification that can communicate with the CP country classifications, but it shifts, if you want, its analytical roster from supply-side factors and supply-side-oriented institutions to mechanisms of demand formation. So in that sense, it becomes a lot more Keynesian inspiration. And by the way of becoming Keynesian, of course, there also sneaks in a lot more instability. of the growth process. Because if you have a supply side understanding of the growth process, that one tends to be a lot smoother, versus if you have a more Keynesian understanding of the growth process, it sort of invites a lot more analysis of recessions or of financial crisis or something like that. Now, because they're coming from political sciences, of course, that literature, Bacar and Pontusson themselves, but in particular the things that follow after, are a lot more interested in the political processes behind it. And that's in particular the political coalition that enables certain growth models, the policies that are necessary, and what interest groups will support them. And they also use at times Gramscian terminology like a social bloc, but at times it's closer to electoral policy. I mean, these are questions that are increasingly remote from what economists are doing, but that sort of expresses the fact that it's political economy and not just economy. But as I said, so that was the big starting point, but if you want a current reference, take a look at the Bacar, Blythe and Pontusson book. Now, in the meantime, there has been a lot of references to that and a lot of research built, if at times eclectic on it. This slide, I'm mentally with the next slide. This slide actually wants to say that there are similar movements in other subfields of these, of those political economy subfields. In particular, in international political economy, you have a very similar important paper. Unfortunately, it's not as important, but it's a similar main argument. That's the Blythe and Matthias paper with the missing macroeconomics of IP was the title, where they're essentially saying that a lot of the IPE is not having enough instability, not having enough Keynesian macro foundations, if you want. And Mark Blythe is now, if you want, part of the growth models grouping as well. Now, to be fair, in IPE, there actually has been quite a reception, but eclectic, of Keynesian ideas, and that's around the notion of financialization. In IPE, you have big debates on financial system, on shadow banking, but also on international monetary hierarchies. And in these, of course, Keynesian arguments pop up every now and then, in particular Minskian arguments around shadow banking, but also the financialization debates in which post-Keynesians, including myself, were involved. So if you want, the CPE debates growth models is picking up so far much more on the Kaleckian aspect of post-Keynesian economics. And in my papers, I complain bitterly that financial instability and Minsky is not sufficiently there. I also complain that there's not enough Kaldor, but then of course I'm a post-Keynesian, I would say things like that. Whereas in the IP literature, there has been a selective reading of some of the financial aspects. You will notice that the categories of the growth models literature and arguments at various points actually get quite close to what some of you might remember is the French regulation theory, the modes of regulations and regimes of accumulation. And indeed, in many ways, it's similar, but there is one very important difference, and that is that the regulationists and the American cousins, the social structures of accumulation, were very much interested in variation of types of capitalism over time. So it's in a way from Fordism to neoliberalism. Whereas the CPE is much more interested in cross-country differences. So in that sense, while there are similarities, they're certainly not the same. So how do we empirically identify those growth models? And this is now the slide where I give you a couple of post-Keynesian authors that have tried to answer that, and a big part of the literature here uses GDP decomposition. So it's essentially the starting point for identifying growth models is splitting up the sources of GDP growth into investment growth, consumption growth, net export growth, and so on. Now, I will actually criticize that in 7 minutes, but first let me be clear what it is that I'm criticizing and why that's not a completely unreasonable approach. Eckhard Hein, in sort of a whole long list of papers, has done that, and also in our 2013 book. And what's neat about this, in a way, is how simple it is, and that is actually quite useful if the main competing growth models that you're interested in is debt-led growth versus export-led growth. Then those GDP growth decompositions or contributions, as they are sometimes called, are actually quite useful. And so various authors have then expanded on that in more recent work by Eckhard Hein. It's those growth contributions or GDP decompositions on the one hand, but then there's also changes in the sectoral balances to more properly account for the debt-led element of it. Bacaro with co-authors are very interested in in adjusting export growth, but also other GDP components for their import content. So that's sort of building on the debate of value-added exports to make it compatible with other GDP components. And they get very excited about that. Empirically, what they find is essentially that nowadays almost all countries are export-led, which I'm not fully convinced is a very useful finding for comparative political economy. Now, there's also some people in this room, if they're still here, yes, they are. Morlin et al. Have a neat paper where sort of they take a more super multiplier approach, which in some ways matches the basic intuition of a lot of the growth models writing, in the sense that implicitly they seem to have an understanding of autonomous components, though they don't have a super, Morlin et al. Yes, but the rest of the CP literature doesn't necessarily have a super multiplier model in their background. So there's an attempt to start that conversation. So what I'm trying to say here is that this is, so to speak, getting broader, and there's different aspects that coming into the debate, and there's an area where post-Keynesians can do useful work. Now, in the case studies, there are sort of interesting variations that are very useful for case studies. It's not quite clear what exactly they mean theoretically. So, for example, for the studies for Ireland in particular, but also Hungary, an FDI-led growth model has been identified. In a very neat paper for China, there is a role for a state-led growth model. Indeed, they're arguing that China is a mixture of state-led and export-led growth model. And again, for China, that's a good story, but both the FDI and the state-led growth model don't actually give you general definitions or criteria by which you could identify. I mean, we know that it fits for that country, but we don't know how to generally define it. There's also for developing country commodity-led growth, which again, intuitively makes a lot of sense, but it's not strictly defined. So just to illustrate, that's what Eckhard Hein does. I'm afraid you won't be able to see that, but that's his table, so not my fault if you can't read it. So it's essentially the growth decomposition that you get straight from AMECO or anywhere else. How much does consumption, investment, net export, and so on contribute from year to year? And then there are some other requirements. And then we find that post-crisis, most countries, by the way, including Italy, in case you were wondering, are export-led. And that's for the post-crisis period, and that what myself and in this case the co-author, Carsten Köhler, were unhappy with. Yeah, so here you have some criticism of that approach to decomposition. Essentially, our argument is that that simple way of thinking about the growth decompositions of GDP is useful if your only question is, are countries export-led or are they debt-led? But it can give you really quite misleading results. The simplest illustration is, so think of a country that has had that has a major recession and is thus running current account surpluses. It was running current account surpluses, say, because it had a major house price bubble, and that house price bubble collapsed. and think then that this is further amplified by a completely absurd government policy that is pursuing austerity policies in the midst of this recession. So in other words, I'm talking about the euro crisis, I'm talking about, say, Spain. Yeah? Now, if you look at GDP growth contributions, you'll find that Spain and Italy and other southern European countries post-global financial crisis are export-led. My argument is that's a complete misreading what's going on. It's not that exports are the drivers, it's really that you have a recession that's caused A, by austerity, and B, by a house price collapse that results in low domestic demand, and thus you get less imports, and that shows up in the GDP as an increasing value in net exports. And then there's a table that does that, and that essentially shows that if you look at the sources of that improvement in the current decomposition, it's mostly coming from imports. In other words, it's precisely not export-led. If you want, it's import-led, because the imports are collapsing so much. It's also not leading to growth. Yeah? So it's not an export-led growth model. Yeah? So that's the criticism. So what do we do instead? We essentially take one step back. We are looking at growth drivers. What's the difference between growth drivers and growth models? There's 2 points. One is a conceptual, one is an empirical one. Conceptually, we're saying, assume that you have a major crisis, then you shouldn't immediately assume that you have a valid growth model. You will have different growth drivers that may not add up to a consistent growth model. Yeah? So in other words, I'm more inspired here by the French regulation, is that after a crisis, doesn't necessarily immediately start the next valid accumulation regime. Maybe there's just a mess, or what is often called now secular stagnation. Yeah? The second is a methodological one, and that is, let's not look at the GDP growth composition, but let's look at factors that are not part of GDP, but driving GDP components. So we're looking at fiscal policy, we're looking at house prices, and potentially you can extend that list. And that is an illustration to illustrate the relation between growth drivers and demand regimes and growth decomposition. I hope you can read it. So to the very left, we have those factors, which we call growth drivers, that are, if you want, in the regression, the explanatory variables. That might be a wage share, that might be house prices, that might be household debt, that might be variables of fiscal policy, that could be competitiveness, and so on. I mean, you can extend that list, obviously. Then the question is, how do these variables, say the wage share, affect demand components? That's part of what we have done as demand regime analysis. Now, is the economy wage-led or profit-led? Is it debt-led or is it debt-burdened, and so on? Is the fiscal multiplier high? Is it low? So that's essentially the demand regime. Then you get, as outcome of these growth drivers, certain GDP components that you can look at with growth decompositions. And if those growth drivers change in a consistent pattern, and if you want to work together productively, then as an outcome you get growth. Then you have a growth model. But actually you cannot have a growth model, you can have a stagnation model where the growth drivers don't go together. So that's sort of where we want to get it. And then in this paper with Carsten Kohler and a companion paper on Southern Europe, we look at different hypotheses for those growth drivers. That's from the second paper. So we have a housing boom hypothesis, a financial curse argument that comes from the political science literature that essentially is making a case that it's the financial inflows to Southern Europe that caused the house price boom. It's a separate story. Don't worry too much about it. And we have fiscal policy, we have technological change that's more mainstreamish, where it's about R&D expenditures, we have cost competitiveness, and then we could have a structuralist non-cost competitiveness. And then there's examples from literature. And so effectively in those papers, we do very simple plausibility tests for this. Now, I emphasize very simple plausibility tests. These are both papers that came out in those political economy journals. Different from an economics journal, there's no premium on fancy econometrics. In an economics paper, you need a complicated model and you need the most up-to-date economic test. That would be an incentive in the political economy journals to say, nice paper, wrong journal. So we're trying to think of the simplest econometric or statistical exercises that we can do that still drive home our point. So essentially what we're doing is we're having 2x2 scatter plots to illustrate how important the mechanism might be. And of course, at the end, we do run simple regressions. In the first paper, the Engelbert Stockhammer and Ripe, we essentially just do cross-country regressions. That's with a lot of OECD countries. In the more recent one, we only look at Southern European countries. And there we're having several observations for each country, essentially for different growth periods. Essentially pre-global post-global financial crisis, pre-global financial crisis, crisis itself, and then the first one should not be pre-global financial, but pre-euro. So essentially 4 observations per country, and then we pool all of these happily, which you may object to for good reason, but that's what we do. So that's the result, what we get, and I focus on the one where we find interesting things. So that's the simple plot, and that's only the 5 Southern European countries, and usually 4 observations per country. And that is plotting first house prices against GDP growth. And what you see is sort of, this is almost a perfect regression line, yeah? The lower one is against investment, don't worry about it now. So that essentially illustrates house prices are apparently a good candidate for a valid growth driver. That's a similar exercise for fiscal policy, and as the fiscal policy variable, we use the cyclically adjusted fiscal balance, and again, you find a very good, a very tight relation. You may notice that the upper plot has an outlier, unsurprisingly, that's Greece. If we drop this Greece outlier during the Euro crisis, we essentially get a very similar fit. Contrary, if we do the same exercise for R&D expenditures, there's essentially no link. If we do the same for cost competitiveness, that's unit labor costs, and then we also do it with real effective exchange rate, you either get no link or you get a perverse link. Higher unit labor costs, higher growth. And I should say, these findings are essentially the same that we got in the cross-country exercises with a much richer, with more diverse countries. Somewhat more surprisingly, so I don't like that result as much, that is the economic complexity index against, in this case, it's actually not GDP growth, but that's the growth of exports. So we're directly checking the link between economic complexity and growth, which we think of as a test of the structuralist hypothesis. In the other paper, we found a bit friendlier results, but with this one, we actually didn't find a result. And then we also do the regression, which essentially gives you the same, that we consistently find statistically significant results for house prices and for the structural deficit. Now, this regression has all sorts of problems. It has few degrees of freedom. It does have potential simultaneity issues, less so for the fiscal variable, because that by design should be independent of GDP, more so for house prices. So in other words, in an econ journal, this might not have gotten published. The way I think about it is really more as a plausibility test. No? So if we do not find statistical significance, you can't really convince me that this is an important growth driver in that period. No? If we do find statistical significance, it's a good candidate, but actually we don't know for sure in which direction the causality goes. So with, in particular, the house prices, that coefficient is certainly too high for the actual effect, because it probably has the causality from house prices to GDP and from GDP to house prices. So it's too high, but it still gives you a sense that something important is going on there. And I have other research where I would argue that the house prices have a genuine impact. So the short version, what do we find of those with those growth drivers? We do find essentially that it's a story of a housing boom and bust, because a big part of variation is the crisis and the secular stagnation. and of fiscal policy. Now, that's important for the comparative political economy literature, first because they tend to think of debt, often they think of what I call the debt-driven growth model as consumption-led growth. Yeah? In my story, it's actually not so much about consumption, it's most of all of house prices. If you take a Minskian perspective, which I most decidedly do, then house prices have a cycle. They will go up as well as they will go down. So in other words, if you have a not functioning growth model because you have a house price cycle, that doesn't mean that you don't have a debt-driven growth model. It just means that you have a debt-driven growth model with a cycle. So it's a different interpretation of where we are. The second issue about fiscal policy, that's essentially absent currently from much of the CP literature. Yeah? And I actually think it's post-Keynesians should also be doing more on it. Yeah? I mean, if you think about what the new Keynesians have created on literature, on estimating, identifying the multiplier with different institutions, with regime dependence on whether you are or are not at the zero lower bound, and how many post-Keynesian papers, I have to say I'm almost embarrassed. Yeah? I mean, we should have been writing these papers, not these guys who until 2008 were strictly denying that any of that is important. Yeah? I mean, in a way we said that, but we unfortunately didn't do the research. Yeah, and that's the illustration of the credit cycle. I actually have slides on this. Yeah, that gives you more references that, sorry. That one is important to me. That is sort of the simplest illustration that house price cycle is really a cycle. Yeah? That's the scatter plot between house prices before the global financial crisis and after the global financial crisis. Yeah? So this is not just the US or Spanish or Irish. Yeah? If you do cross-country, that's very clear. If you do within countries, I would argue it's also very clear, and several follow-up papers on that. So these are the sort of a peak trough identification for the UK, and we do that for lots of countries in a recent paper with Ben Tippett and Carsten Kohler, and then try to demonstrate that the intensity of the house price cycle has to do with the institutions on the housing market, the taxation of capital gains, and other things. Okay, that was about house prices, and the main message there, I think house prices are really important macroeconomically. Then the issue of state-led growth, that I think is underdeveloped in CP. There's a big part of it that's sort of the Keynesian argument about counter-cyclical fiscal policy, that if you want is the left column there. I think there's also an important supply-side story there, that actually some of the papers that I've heard earlier today they have some of the story about that, if you want, about in a narrower sense the role of the state in fostering innovation. That's Fred Bloch's paper, that's Mazzucato, Robert Waite have neat papers on that essentially are arguing that the US actually has a very strong developmental state with respect to innovation. Now, in the development literature, you of course have a much broader notion of the developmental state, and I think it's that notion of developmental state that we should relate to when we think about the supply side aspect. So that involves infrastructure, that involves education, that involves the financial sector, that involves industrial policy and so on. And so part of the innovation literature does it, but for my taste, it's a bit too narrow for what I have in mind as state-led growth. I really like the comparative historical sociology, that's Michael Mann and Charles Tilley, going back to Barrington Moore. And in that literature, you have a very strong notion of the state, where sort of in various stages of historical development, the state, what do I want to get at? So in Gerschenkron, you need a strong state for those countries that have to catch up. You don't need it, sort of, he follows List and said, once you're developed, you don't need the state anymore. Yeah? Now, the comparative, the neo-Weberian comparative historical sociology is emphasizing that you always have a strong state, because you can't, in a way it's more Polanyi. You always have the state there. And even if you think about the old Romans and their military army, that military army was at the same time an army of civil engineers. And there's this cute studies that the marching baggage of the poor Roman soldiers, that was 30 kilos or something like that, most of that weight actually was building equipment, because they were building roads and bridges and their camps and so on. And Mann's argument is that infrastructure stays there. These roads that you've built, those bridges, they're built for military, but of course they're there afterwards for trade or whatever you want to do. Same for the railways that Germany built such that they could connect the Eastern and the Western Front. But of course you can also ship all sorts of other things. Yeah? So in other words, there's a very constituent sense of the role of the state. And if you think of charterless theories of money, you have a similar motive. Yeah? So it's this that I would like to see in my all-encompassing theory or notion of state-led growth, but no idea how to do that empirically. Okay, what does all that have to do with growth models? How many minutes? Sorry, that's?
The time is already...
I'm out of time. That's true, okay.
If you want to go to London this night...
then I'll try to finish in 3 minutes. So, essentially I'm saying if we have higher interest rates, that has big implications for house prices, and it has big implications for fiscal policy. For house prices, it means if we have a sustained increase of interest rates, it will be much harder for households to service high mortgages. And that means that we'll have a problem with house prices. Now, admittedly, that's a bit of I'm living in Britain now, it's a bit of a British perspective, but I think it's much more important than you might realize for other countries. So to the left, you have the euro area. Now, admittedly, that's weighted, so Germany has a disproportionate role in there, but what you see there is that you have a massive increase, rebound in real estate prices since the trough of after the global financial crisis. If you go to the US, it's actually mind-boggling. Yeah? I mean, by many accounts, there is a bigger house price bubble now than you had in 2008. Yeah? I'm not necessarily saying they will come down all the way. I'm saying there is a big possibility for downward adjustment, because after a decade of essentially zero interest rates, it was very easy to take out large mortgages. If mortgages go up to normal levels, say 3–5%, it will be a lot harder. Yeah? And in Britain, that has set in and will cause big trouble. I'll skip the details. Fiscal policy. You essentially have the same issue. Once interest rates rise, that whole concern about all government debt as percent of GDP is so high will come back. Now here, ultimately, it's not so much about interest rates, it's about quantitative easing. And I would very strongly suspect that within the next 2 years, the ECB will have a big question facing itself. What does it do when the sovereign debt spreads are going to rise again? Is it going to suppress them and restart QE, which it doesn't really want to do anymore? Or is it going to let whatever sneaking version of the euro crisis come back? Yeah? So in that sense, I do think that that rise in interest rates will have quite strong potential effect on the growth performance, and in a way, the secular stagnation will come back with a vengeance. And it will come back with a vengeance because the room, at least the perceived room of maneuver for monetary policy and therefore for fiscal policy will be a lot less, and that muddling through of having central bank finance government spending without ever admitting that this is what they're doing, that's not going to work after the big inflation, so to speak. What does that mean for progressive economic policy? And I promise that's the last slide. That essentially is that politically there's much less room for Keynesian policy. Now, I'm not saying that theoretically we can't do it, but politically it will be a lot more difficult to pursue Keynesian policy. In other words, we have to switch away from Keynesian arguments, and we have to present arguments how we can finance expenditures, because we need government expenditure. We need them on housing, we need them on decarbonization, we need them on the care economy and so on. But essentially it has to be a use value argument rather than a demand argument. And it will involve a case for higher taxation. And that's corporate taxation and offshoring of tax incomes, but it's also about housing wealth, which the middle classes will not like. So a lot of it is politically delicate. But I think over the next 5 years, that's the argument that we have to make. Okay, with that, I think I've almost kept to the time. And thank you for your attention.
Really thanks to Engelbert for this very interesting final lecture. So, I mean, we have time for 2 short questions and for a quick answer, okay? In order to have the possibility, yes, we close at 5 minutes. I mean, no later if you want to go to London this night. Okay, so yes, now I am the dictator. So I chose Gennaro Zezza one and the other one, Giovanni. Okay. So very short question, please.
Thank you for a very interesting and very depressing presentation, given your conclusion. My question is on home prices. Now, before the great financial crisis, home prices were translated into a large increase in household debt. I don't think this is happening right now, and I don't think that the drivers of growth will be the same. So what is your take on this?
Thank you, Gennaro. Now, I'm going here.
Very little question. No, in your explanation, dealing with growth drivers, financial variables can analyzed only on the side of wealth effect or in partial strange relationship with industry. In a slide there was a connection, the house price boom, art industry. I don't understand very well this kind of connection, but in my opinion there is also probably some other roles played by financial variables on the supply side. I understand that your approach is post-Keynesian and probably also Keynesian, so the demand side is the central point of view, but probably there are also other effects of financial variables on the supply side.
Thank you. Okay, Engelbert.
I'm happy to go till 6:10. I have miscalculated the timing. I'm happy to take.
Okay, so other 2 questions. Okay, perfect.
I totally agree with you that the variety of capitalism literature is not Keynesian or post-Keynesian, but I think it's a little too much to say that it is exclusively informed by mainstream economists. I'm thinking, for example, of Bruno Amable and the regulation school that I would not classify as mainstream.
Okay. And so now the last question. Do you like to do a question? Okay. On the super multiplier, I mean.
Not really, actually. So you quickly mentioned Baccaro's and Pontus's interpretation on the path followed by advanced economists after the 80s, and you said something like you don't agree and other post-Keynesians don't agree. Maybe you could give us a hint on your interpretation. And also, I see your point on the growth drivers, but then I really like that figure you presented where you connect the components, demand and the growth drivers. So I would like to confirm with you if you think that these 2 methodologies are complementary in the sense that the composition can show the relative importance of each component of demand, and then you can look at growth drivers to map this.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks for all these great questions. Gennaro, I like your question. I don't quite draw your conclusion from it. But first, I think you're very right. If you look at the current house price boom, you don't have the corresponding changes in household debt, and it puzzles me. Yeah? If you look at Germany, they have a massive house price boom. Household debt doesn't do much. If you look at Ireland I don't know how they managed to decrease their household debt and have a house price boom. That's beyond me. Yeah? So I admit I don't have an answer for that. I think it's a very good question, and I would really like to have an answer. One possibility is that it's a bit about where you are in the cycle, yeah? But I have no evidence that this really explains the story. But intuitively, it makes some sense. Now, in practice, and you notice that when you work with household data, at any point in time, a lot of people are paying off their mortgages wherever you are in the cycle because they just took it out, whatever, 5-10 years ago. Versus the real action in a way is with the new mortgages. Yeah? So it might be that in the early phases of the cycle, the volumes of the new mortgages is not big enough yet to fully exhaust the savings or the reserves, and therefore household debt isn't rising that much. And as the boom gets in full swing and house prices are sufficiently high, then you need more debt. Yeah? But that's a hypothesis that I would explore, but I don't know what that is. The reason why I don't fully agree with your conclusion is that when I do my plots, I do find that break for many countries between household debt and house prices. But what changes is that the link ultimately between household debt and GDP. The link between house prices and GDP in whatever plots I've drawn is very solid. So in that sense, I think that we might have overemphasized the role of household debt because there was the big hip issue after the global financial crisis, but the house price cycles are there and you feel them in GDP. That would be my answer to that. Yeah? So in that sense, I'm not fully convinced that we will have different growth drivers, but in principle, we should explore more growth drivers and not the one. We shouldn't fight the last battle, yeah? So in that sense, I'm open to what you say. The supply and demand side, yes, I'm quite Keynesian there. I do see some supply side effects. That's a question, what exactly you do with the banks. Yeah? A big part of the effect I would have thought is on the balance sheets of banks and the implication that has for their willingness to lend. Yeah? So, I mean, I'm not a full horizontalist. I think that credit rationing is important, and if the commercial banks' balance sheets are hit, that will affect their lending standards. If that's the case, you have an immediate effect on growth. Is that a supply side or a demand side effect? It's difficult to classify. Yeah? To me, it's more on the demand side, but you could equally say that's a supply side effect. If you qualify it as a supply side effect, that I'm happy to grant. Other than that, I'm a Keynesian. Carlo, Bruno, Mabel, yes. You're right, but I think I mean, maybe Robert Bouyer is actually the more obvious case. I mean, Mabel sits a little bit in between because he likes to be not exactly mainstream, but rational microeconomics consistent. No? Robert Bouyer less so, but he also has used the label. I think that's because they wanted to jump onto the VOC bandwagon because it was hip and they felt this was a vehicle within which they could communicate their message. I don't think it works together very well. I don't think they have the same institutional analysis, because Bouyer clearly is a Keynesian. But it probably is true that in the more institutionalist version, there's a big gray area how much there. So I have probably, for pedagogical reason, I've probably overstated the dichotomy. Yeah? So I think I have to grant you that. Guillaume, Baccaro profit-led, yes. So for Baccaro, it's either wage-led or profit-led, and because we are not in the wage-led regime anymore, we must be in the profit-led. That's not what Eckhart Hein and Marc Lavoie and Özlem Onaran and all the rest of us are saying. Yeah? In our story, demand is still wage-led, and that is precisely why we need other growth drivers. Because if we had a profit-led demand regime, that increase in inequality, that increase in the profit share would anyways lead to growth, and it would lead to growth via business investment. Now, if you look, and there that you'll clearly see in the GDP growth decomposition already, What you do not have in the growth period of neoliberalism is business investment. Yeah? You have consumption growth and you have residential investment, or then in Germany you have export. You do not have business investment. So whatever you have there is not profit-led growth. Yeah? So in that sense, my disagreement with Lucio, and I've explained that 3 times to him, and he still uses the term, so I've given up. But if you meet him, tell him. Yes, growth drivers and decomposition, ultimately, they are consistent. I mean, the decompositions to some extent are tautology. I mean, they're splitting up an identity, so in that sense, they can never be wrong. Where they become wrong is if you use wording that suggests causality. So the positive net export contributions since the global financial crisis, if you call them export-led, suggest that it's because of what happens to export. And what I'm saying, what I'm trying to show with the growth rate is precisely not what's happening. Yeah? So in that sense, it's in a particular context, they're misleading. In some way, they're a truism because they come out of the national accounts. Yeah? So, but in that sense, I think you need the growth drivers to understand what's going on. Yeah? But ultimately, yes, of course, they're complementary.
Okay, so I close the conference. Thank you again to Professor Stockhammer, and your cab is now outside the faculty.